The poor girl approached the abandoned bride and whispered, "Give me food, and I will bring your husband back." Her plea was met with silence, as everyone turned away and ignored her desperate words. Yet the moment soon shifted when the unexpected began to unfold. Morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, casting rainbow prisms across the white marble floor. Sarah Elizabeth Thompson stood before the ornate mirror in the bridal suite, adjusting her grandmother's pearl necklace for the 100th time. Her wedding dress, an exquisite creation of ivory silk and French lace, had been her dream gown since she was a little girl playing dress-up in her mother's closet. "You look absolutely radiant, sweetheart," her mother, Margaret Thompson, whispered as she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "I've never seen you more beautiful." Sarah's reflection smiled back at her, though her stomach fluttered with nervous excitement. Today was supposed to be the beginning of her fairy tale, marrying Michael Davidson, the successful investment banker she'd been dating for 3 years. They'd met at a charity gala in downtown Chicago, and from their first dance, she'd felt certain he was the one. The bridesmaids bustled around her in their soft lavender dresses, her sister Emma, her college roommate Jessica, and her cousin Amy. They chattered excitedly about the reception, the flowers, and how handsome Michael had looked at the rehearsal dinner the night before. "5 minutes until showtime," called David, the wedding coordinator, poking his head through the door. "The groom's party is in position, and we have a full house out there." Sarah's heart raced as she took one final look in the mirror. Everything was perfect. The church was decorated with white roses and baby's breath, exactly as she'd envisioned. The reception at the Four Seasons was set for 200 guests, complete with a string quartet and a menu she and Michael had carefully selected together. Her wedding planner had assured her that everything was proceeding flawlessly. As the bridal party made their way to the back of the church, Sarah could hear the gentle murmur of conversations from the pews. Through the partially open doors, she glimpsed the sea of familiar faces. Friends from college, colleagues from her job at the marketing firm, Michael's business associates, and family members who had traveled from across the country. The organist began the processional music, and Sarah felt a surge of joy so pure it nearly took her breath away. This was it. This was her moment. Emma squeezed her hand. "Ready, sis?" "More than ready," Sarah whispered back, her voice trembling with emotion. One by one, the bridesmaids glided down the aisle. Sarah watched through the doorway as guests rose to their feet, turning to catch glimpses of the approaching bridal party. She could see Michael's groomsmen standing at attention at the altar, his brother James, his college buddy Ryan, and his business partner Kevin. But something felt off. Where the groom should have been standing, there was only empty space. Sarah's smile faltered slightly, but she reasoned that Michael was probably just running a few minutes late. He'd been working on a big deal all week, and punctuality had never been his strongest suit. The wedding march began, Wagner's traditional bridal chorus, and Sarah's father, Robert Thompson, offered her his arm with tears of pride in his eyes. "My little girl," he whispered, "all grown up." They began their walk down the aisle, and Sarah tried to maintain her composure even as her eyes searched frantically for Michael at the altar. The guests' faces, initially bright with anticipation, began to show signs of confusion and concern. Reverend Mitchell stood alone at the altar, his expression growing increasingly uncomfortable as he glanced toward the side door where the groom should have emerged. Sarah reached the front of the church, her heart pounding not with joy but with a growing sense of dread. Her father hesitated before lifting her veil, his own confusion evident. "Where is he?" Sarah whispered to James, Michael's best man. James looked stricken. I don't know, Sarah. He was supposed to be here 20 minutes ago. We've been calling his phone, but—" The church fell into an uncomfortable silence. 200 pairs of eyes watched as the horrible reality began to dawn on everyone present. The groom was not coming. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Sarah stood frozen at the altar, her beautiful bouquet trembling in her hands. The whispers from the pews grew louder, a buzzing sound that seemed to close in around her. Maybe there's been an accident, someone suggested. Has anyone checked his apartment? Another voice called out. But deep in her heart, Sarah knew the truth. This wasn't about traffic or emergencies. Michael had simply chosen not to show up. He had abandoned her at the altar, in front of everyone she loved, on what was supposed to be the most important day of her life. The humiliation washed over her in waves. Her carefully planned wedding, her dreams of marital bliss, her future with the man she thought loved her, all of it crumbled in the space of those agonizing minutes. Reverend Mitchell approached her gently. "Sarah, dear, perhaps we should—" "He's not coming," she said quietly, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the sudden hush of the church. "Michael's not coming." The words hung in the air like a death sentence to all her hopes and dreams. Margaret Thompson rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her daughter as Sarah's composure finally shattered. The tears came then, hot and bitter, staining the beautiful silk of her grandmother's dress. "Get me out of here," Sarah whispered through her sobs. "Please, just get me out of here." But as the family began to gather around her, preparing to escort her from the scene of her devastation, something unexpected happened. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the church creaked open, and a small figure appeared silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. It was a little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, with tangled dark hair and clothes that had seen better days. She was clearly homeless, her small frame thin from hunger, her shoes worn through at the toes. The child stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene before her with eyes that seemed far older than her years. Then, with a confidence that surprised everyone present, she began walking down the aisle toward the altar. The congregation turned to stare, their shock at the runaway groom now compounded by this unexpected intrusion. Who was this child? How had she gotten into the church? What was she doing here at this most inappropriate of moments? But the little girl seemed oblivious to their stares and whispers. Her focus was entirely on Sarah, who stood in her wedding dress like a broken angel, tears streaming down her face. As the child approached the altar, her small voice cut through the tension with words that would change everything. "Give me food, and I'll bring back your husband." The little girl's words hung in the air like a challenge to reality itself. "Give me food, and I'll bring back your husband." The congregation erupted in a mixture of gasps, angry murmurs, and uncomfortable shifting in the wooden pews. This homeless waif had just interrupted the most painful moment of Sarah's life, with what seemed like either childish fantasy or cruel mockery. "This is outrageous," bellowed Uncle Harold from the third row, his face red with indignation. "How did this street child get in here? Where's security?" Margaret Thompson stepped protectively in front of her daughter. "Young lady, you need to leave immediately. This is a private ceremony, and you have no business being here." The wedding coordinator, David, hurried down the aisle, his professional composure cracking under the weight of managing not one but 2 crises. "I'm so sorry, everyone. I'll have her removed right away." But as David reached for the child's arm, she stepped back with surprising grace and dignity. Her dark eyes, startlingly clear and deep, swept across the crowd of well-dressed guests before settling on Sarah's tear-stained face. "I'm not here for them," the girl said simply, her voice carrying a strange authority despite her small stature. "I'm here for her." James, Michael's best man, threw his hands up in exasperation. "This is insane. Sarah's been humiliated enough without some delusional kid making it worse. Call the police if you have to." "That child is obviously disturbed," whispered Aunt Patricia loudly enough for half the church to hear. "Look at her. She's probably on drugs or something. These street kids, you never know what they're capable of." The murmurs grew louder and more hostile. The guests, already uncomfortable with the wedding's collapse, now had a convenient target for their frustration and embarrassment. Several men began moving toward the little girl, their intentions clear. But Sarah, through her tears and shock, found herself studying the child's face. There was something about the girl that didn't match her ragged appearance. A serenity, a knowing quality that seemed impossible for someone so young and clearly so disadvantaged. "Get her out of here before she steals something," hissed Mrs. Davidson, Michael's mother, her pearl necklace glinting as she gestured dismissively. These people have no shame, coming here when decent folks are trying to— That's enough. Sarah's voice cut through the growing chaos with unexpected firmness. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup. All of you, that's enough. The church fell silent, surprised by the bride's sudden intervention. Sarah looked at the little girl, really looked at her. The child couldn't have been more than 8, with delicate features that spoke of potential beauty beneath the grime and neglect. Her clothes were clean but worn, a faded pink t-shirt and jeans with holes in the knees. But it was her eyes that captivated Sarah. They held a depth and wisdom that seemed to peer directly into her soul. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Sarah asked gently, ignoring the disapproving sounds from the congregation. "Lucy," the girl replied, her voice soft but clear. "And I meant what I said. Give me food and I'll bring your love back to you." Emma, Sarah's sister, moved closer with obvious concern. "Sarah, honey, you're in shock. You don't know what you're doing. This child is clearly— Well, she needs help, but this isn't the time or place. She's taking advantage of you in your vulnerable state," added Jessica, the maid of honor. "Can't you see that?" But Sarah felt something stirring within her, a strange combination of recognition and peace that made no logical sense. While everyone around her saw only an interruption, an intrusion, a problem to be solved, Sarah saw something else entirely. "You're all wrong," Sarah said quietly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Look at her. Really look at her." The congregation shifted restlessly. They wanted the child gone so they could return to the familiar territory of offering condolences and making plans to salvage what they could of the day. The presence of this homeless girl complicated everything, making their discomfort even more acute. "Sarah, darling," her mother pleaded, "you're not thinking clearly. You've had a terrible shock. Let us handle this." But Sarah was thinking more clearly than she had in months, perhaps years. Standing there in her wedding dress, abandoned and humiliated, she felt a sudden clarity about what truly mattered. This child, hungry, alone, and somehow radiating an inexplicable sense of purpose, needed help. And helping her felt like the first right thing Sarah could do in a day that had gone so terribly wrong. "No," Sarah said firmly, surprising herself with her resolve. "I won't let you treat her this way." She stepped forward and knelt down to the little girl's eye level, her wedding dress pooling around her like spilled cream. "Lucy, are you hungry?" The child nodded solemnly. "Very hungry. I haven't eaten since yesterday." Sarah's heart clenched. While she had been worried about flower arrangements and seating charts, this little girl had been going without food. The contrast struck her with profound force. "Then let's fix that right now," Sarah announced, standing and taking Lucy's small, dirty hand in her own manicured one. The gesture sent shockwaves through the assembled guests. "Sarah, you can't be serious," her father protested. "You're upset. You're not thinking—" "I'm thinking perfectly clearly." "Dad." Sarah looked around at the faces of her family and friends, people she had thought would support her through anything, but who were now more concerned with propriety than compassion. "This little girl is hungry. She asked for help. And I'm going to help her." "Where are you going?" Margaret demanded as Sarah began walking toward the church door, still holding Lucy's hand. "To get her some food," Sarah replied simply. The wedding coordinator stepped into their path. Miss Thompson, I really must insist that we handle this through proper channels. There are procedures for dealing with situations like this." Sarah looked at him with new eyes, seeing him not as the helpful professional she'd hired, but as just another obstacle between a hungry child and a meal. "The only situation here is that a little girl needs food and I'm going to provide it." She paused, looking back at the congregation one more time. "The reception is paid for. The food will be served. You're all welcome to go and enjoy it. But I have somewhere else I need to be." With that, Sarah Thompson walked out of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, hand in hand with a homeless child, leaving behind 200 shocked guests and the ruins of her carefully planned wedding day. 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself sitting across from Lucy in the dining room of the Whitmore, one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants. The maître d' had initially looked askance at the unusual pair, a bride in full, wedding regalia accompanied by what appeared to be a street child, but something in Sarah's demeanor had convinced him to seat them at a quiet corner table. "Order anything you want," Sarah told Lucy, gesturing to the leather-bound menu. "Absolutely anything." Lucy studied the menu with the seriousness of a scholar examining ancient texts. Her finger traced the elaborate descriptions of dishes with names in French and Italian. "I can't read very well yet," she admitted without shame. "But I can tell this is a fancy place." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Sarah said softly. "What sounds good to you?" Lucy's eyes lit up. "Could I have a hamburger? With French fries? And maybe some ice cream?" Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed all day. "Of course. And we'll start with some soup to warm you up." As they waited for their food, Sarah found herself studying her unexpected companion. Up close, Lucy was even more intriguing than she'd first appeared. Despite her obvious poverty and the dirt smudged on her cheeks, there was something almost luminous about her. Her dark hair, though tangled, was thick and beautiful. Her skin, beneath the grime, was smooth and healthy. And those eyes, they held depths that seemed impossible in someone so young. "Lucy," Sarah said gently, "where are your parents?" "Your family?" The little girl looked out the window at the busy Chicago street. "I don't have any family anymore. They're with the angels now." The simple statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. This child was completely alone in the world. "Where do you live? Where do you sleep at night?" Lucy turned back to her with those remarkable eyes. "Different places. The shelter when there's room. Sometimes in the park when it's warm. Sometimes in the church doorway." Sarah felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the tears of humiliation she'd cried earlier. These were tears of compassion, of recognition of suffering far greater than her own. The soup arrived, a rich butternut squash bisque with a delicate swirl of cream. Lucy ate with the focused intensity of someone who never knew when her next meal might come, but also with surprising grace and manners. "This is the most beautiful food I've ever seen," Lucy said between spoonfuls. "Thank you for bringing me here." "Thank you for giving me somewhere to go," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the honesty of the statement. Lucy set down her spoon and looked directly at Sarah. "You're very sad about your wedding man not coming." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "But you shouldn't be," Lucy continued with that strange, calm certainty. "He wasn't the right one for you anyway. The right one is coming soon." "Lucy, sweetie, I know you're trying to make me feel better, but—" "I'm not trying to make you feel better," the child interrupted gently. "I'm telling you what's true. The man who didn't come today, he was going to make you very unhappy. He was selfish and mean, and he would have broken your heart worse later." Sarah stared at the little girl. There was something in Lucy's tone, in her absolute conviction, that made the words feel less like childish comfort and more like prophecy. "How could you possibly know that?" Lucy smiled, and for a moment her whole face seemed to glow with an inner light. "I just know things sometimes, and I know that in exactly 2 weeks, you're going to meet the man who will love you the way you deserve to be loved." The hamburger arrived, a towering creation with all the accompaniments Lucy had requested. She ate with obvious pleasure, but also shared bites with Sarah, insisting that sharing makes everything taste better. As they ate, Lucy talked about many things with the easy confidence of someone much older. She spoke about kindness and how it came back to people who gave it freely. She talked about patience and how the best things in life were worth waiting for. She discussed courage and how sometimes the bravest thing you could do was walk away from something that looked right but felt wrong. "How do you know all these things?" Sarah asked, increasingly amazed by this extraordinary child. "When you don't have much," Lucy replied thoughtfully, "you learn to pay attention to what really matters. And when you're hungry and scared, you notice when people are kind. You remember it." Sarah felt something shifting inside her, like a door opening that had been closed for a very long time. She realized that in all her months of wedding planning, in all her excitement about the dress and the flowers and the reception, she had never once sat quietly and thought about whether Michael was truly the right person for her to spend her life with. She had been so focused on the wedding that she had forgotten to examine the marriage it was supposed to create. "Lucy," she said slowly, "what if you're wrong? What if Michael was supposed to be my husband, and now I've lost my chance at happiness?" Lucy reached across the table and patted Sarah's hand with her small, sticky fingers. "Oh, sweet Sarah," she said, her voice carrying impossible depths of compassion. "You haven't lost anything. You've been saved from something that would have hurt you very much." Over the course of their meal, something beautiful and unexpected happened. Sarah found herself telling Lucy things she had never shared with anyone. Her secret fears about marriage. Her worries that she might not be lovable enough to keep someone's attention. Her sadness about feeling like she had to be perfect all the time. Lucy listened with the kind of attention adults rarely gave each other, nodding at the right moments, asking thoughtful questions, offering insights that were both simple and profound. "You know what I think?" Lucy said as she finished her ice cream. "I think you've been trying so hard to be what other people wanted that you forgot to be yourself. And that's why the wrong man could fool you for so long." Sarah felt something click into place, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't even known existed. "What do you mean? The man who didn't come today, did he ever see you cry?" Sarah thought about it. In 3 years of dating Michael, she had always composed herself before seeing him, always made sure she looked perfect, always presented her best self. No, she realized. No, he never did. And did he ever see you when you were sick or tired or scared? Again, Sarah shook her head. She had always made sure to be at her best around Michael, thinking that was what love required. "But today," Lucy continued gently, "you let me see you crying. You let me see you sad and scared and angry, and you still took care of me. That's what real love looks like, taking care of someone even when you're hurting." As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Sarah felt a strange reluctance to end this unexpected encounter. There was something about Lucy that made her feel more centered, more herself than she had in years. "Lucy," she said as they walked to her car, "I know this sounds crazy, but would you like to come home with me? Just for tonight? You could have a bath, some clean clothes, a warm bed." Lucy smiled but shook her head. "That's very kind, but I have somewhere I need to be tonight. Someone else who needs help." Sarah felt a pang of disappointment. "Will I see you again?" "Oh, yes," Lucy said with complete confidence. "You'll see me again when you need to." "But Sarah?" "Yes?" "Don't worry about love anymore. Don't try to find it or force it or make it happen. Just be yourself, your real self, the one you showed me today, and love will find you. I promise." Lucy gave Sarah a quick hug, and for just a moment, Sarah could have sworn she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the child's physical presence. It was like being embraced by pure comfort, pure peace. 2 weeks, Lucy whispered as she pulled away. "Remember, 2 weeks." And then before Sarah could respond, the little girl had disappeared into the crowd of pedestrians on the busy Chicago sidewalk, leaving Sarah standing beside her car in her wedding dress, feeling more hopeful than she had any right to feel. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of difficult conversations and surprising revelations. Sarah had to return wedding gifts, cancel the honeymoon, and endure the pitying looks and well-meaning advice of friends and family. But she also discovered things about Michael that she had somehow missed or ignored during their relationship. His business partner Kevin mentioned in passing how Michael had complained about Sarah being too emotional and high maintenance. Her friend Jessica reluctantly admitted that she had seen Michael flirting with other women at office parties but hadn't known how to tell Sarah. Most painfully, Sarah learned from Michael's brother James that Michael had been having doubts for months, but had been too cowardly to call off the wedding until the very last moment. He said he thought he could go through with it, James confessed over coffee, looking deeply ashamed. But when the morning came, he just panicked and ran. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I should have warned you. But I never thought he'd actually do something so cruel." With each revelation, Lucy's words echoed in Sarah's mind. he would have broken your heart worse later. But the strange thing was, instead of making Sarah feel worse, these discoveries brought her a sense of liberation she hadn't expected. She began to see how much of herself she had suppressed to fit into Michael's vision of the perfect girlfriend. She had dimmed her own light to avoid threatening his ego, had hidden her true thoughts and feelings to maintain harmony. For the first time in years, Sarah began to remember who she really was. Exactly 14 days after her disastrous wedding day, Sarah Thompson found herself in Millennium Park on a crisp autumn afternoon. She had taken to walking there during her lunch breaks from the marketing firm, finding solace in the changing leaves and the gentle hum of city life around her. The past 2 weeks had been a journey of self-discovery unlike anything she had ever experienced. She was sitting on a bench near the Crown Fountain, watching children play in the shallow reflecting pool despite the October chill, when she noticed a commotion near the park's entrance. A small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be an accident. A woman had fallen while jogging and was sitting on the ground, clearly in pain. Without hesitation, Sarah hurried over to help. "Are you okay?" she asked, kneeling beside the injured woman. "I think I've sprained my ankle," the jogger replied, wincing as she tried to move. "I'm such a klutz. I was watching those kids playing and not paying attention to where I was going." As Sarah helped the woman to a nearby bench, she became aware of someone else approaching, a tall man with kind brown eyes and an expression of genuine concern. "I'm a doctor," he said, introducing himself with a gentle smile. "Dr. David Chen. May I take a look?" Sarah watched as Dr. Chen carefully examined the woman's ankle, his touch professional but incredibly gentle. He spoke to her in soothing tones, explaining what he was checking for and assuring her that while it was indeed a sprain, it wasn't severe. "You should still have it x-rayed to be sure," he advised, "but I think you'll be fine with some rest and ice." "I can drive you to the hospital," Sarah offered immediately. "My car is just across the street." The injured woman, whose name was Patricia, looked gratefully between them. "You two are angels. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been here." As they helped Patricia to Sarah's car, she and David fell into easy conversation. She learned that he was an emergency room physician at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, that he had been taking a rare afternoon off to enjoy the beautiful weather, and that he volunteered at a free clinic on weekends. "What about you?" David asked as they drove Patricia to the hospital. "What do you do when you're not rescuing injured joggers?" Sarah found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in weeks. "I work in marketing, but apparently my new calling is playing Good Samaritan." At the hospital, David insisted on staying to make sure Patricia was properly taken care of, even though he wasn't on duty. Sarah watched him interact with the emergency room staff, noting how everyone clearly respected and liked him, how patients visibly relaxed when he spoke to them. "You didn't have to stay," Sarah told him as they waited for Patricia's x-ray results. "Yes, I did," David replied simply. "When someone gets hurt, you don't just drop them off at the door and leave. You make sure they're okay." The philosophy was so different from Michael's approach to life, where every action was calculated for personal benefit, that Sarah felt a small shock of recognition. This was what Lucy had meant about the right kind of love, the kind that took care of people even when it was inconvenient. Patricia's ankle was indeed just sprained, and her husband arrived to take her home, thanking Sarah and David profusely for their kindness. "Can I buy you dinner?" David asked as they walked out of the hospital together. "As a thank you for helping a stranger and for letting me tag along." "You're the one who provided the medical expertise," Sarah protested. "But you're the one who offered to drive her here without even knowing her name," David countered. "That's pretty special." Sarah felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced with Michael, the feeling of being truly seen and appreciated for who she was, not for how she looked or how well she fit into someone else's plans. Over dinner at a small Italian restaurant David recommended, Sarah found herself opening up in ways that surprised her. She told him about her work, her family, her love of old movies and hiking. David listened with the kind of attention that made her feel like the most interesting person in the world. "What about you?" she asked. Why medicine? Why emergency medicine specifically? David's face grew thoughtful. I grew up pretty poor, he said without embarrassment. My parents immigrated from Taiwan with almost nothing. When I was 8, my little sister got really sick and we couldn't afford to take her to a doctor right away. By the time we finally got her to the emergency room, she was much sicker than she needed to be. Is she okay now? She's fine. She's actually a lawyer now, constantly teasing me about how she makes more money than I do, David laughed. But that experience taught me that everyone deserves good medical care, regardless of whether they can pay for it. That's why I do the free clinic work. Sarah felt her heart skip. Here was a man who had turned his own pain into a mission to help others, the exact opposite of Michael, who had turned every minor setback into an excuse for selfishness. That's beautiful, she said softly. What about you? What made you choose marketing? Sarah realized with some embarrassment that she had never really chosen marketing. She had sort of fallen into it because it seemed like a practical career that would allow her to have the kind of lifestyle she thought she wanted. Honestly, she said, surprising herself with her candor. I'm not sure I did choose it. I think I chose safety over passion. What would you do if you could do anything? The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. Not her parents, not her friends, certainly not Michael. I think I'd like to work with children, she said slowly, the words feeling strange but true in her mouth. Maybe in social services or with homeless kids. I had an experience recently that made me realize how much need there is out there, and how much difference one person can make in a child's life. As the evening progressed, Sarah felt something she had never experienced with Michael: complete ease. She didn't have to monitor her words or worry about saying the wrong thing. She didn't have to present a polished version of herself. David seemed to genuinely enjoy her company, laughing at her jokes, asking thoughtful follow-up questions, sharing his own stories with equal openness. I have to confess something, David said as they lingered over coffee. I was supposed to meet my friends for basketball this afternoon, but when I saw that woman fall, I completely forgot about them. I hope they're not too upset. Your friends will understand, Sarah said. Anyone who knows you must be used to you dropping everything to help people. How can you be so sure about that? You've known me for all of 4 hours. Sarah paused, thinking about Lucy's words. You'll recognize him when you meet him. I don't know, she said honestly. I have a good feeling about you. David smiled, and Sarah felt that same warmth she had experienced when Lucy hugged her, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was supposed to be. I have a good feeling about you too, David said softly. As David walked Sarah to her car, she found herself thinking about Lucy's promise. 2 weeks exactly, just as the little girl had predicted. But more than the timing, it was the feeling that convinced her Lucy had been right about everything. Sarah, David said as they reached her car, I know this might sound forward, but would you like to have dinner again tomorrow? And maybe the day after that, and possibly every day after that for the foreseeable future? Sarah laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. That sounds perfect. Good, because I have season tickets to the Chicago Symphony, and I was really hoping to find someone who might enjoy going with me. You have symphony tickets? My one extravagance, David admitted sheepishly. I love classical music, but none of my friends share my enthusiasm. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, happy tears this time. Michael had always complained that classical music was boring and pretentious. He had never once asked what she enjoyed or made an effort to share her interests. I love the symphony, she whispered. David's face lit up. Really? Really? Brahms is my favorite composer. Mine too, David said, and Sarah could hear the wonder in his voice. The Second Symphony particularly. With the Vienna Philharmonic recording from 1973, Sarah added. David stared at her for a moment, then began to laugh. Okay, this is getting scary. That's exactly the recording I was listening to this morning. As Sarah drove home that night, she couldn't stop smiling. Lucy had been right about everything. About Michael being the wrong man, about Sarah needing to be her true self. about love finding her when she least expected it. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's relationship with David blossomed in ways that felt both effortless and profound. He met her family and charmed them with his genuine warmth and obvious devotion to Sarah. She visited him at the free clinic and watched him treat homeless children with the same care and respect he gave to wealthy patients. "You're glowing," her sister Emma observed one afternoon as they had lunch together. "I don't think I've ever seen you this happy." "I feel like myself again," Sarah replied. "Actually, I feel like myself for the first time in years." "David's amazing," Emma agreed. "But you know what? You're different too. You're more, I don't know, more present, more real." Sarah knew exactly what Emma meant. With David, she never felt the need to perform or pretend. She could be sad when she was sad, excited when she was excited, silly when she felt playful. He seemed to love all the parts of her, not just the polished public version. One evening, as they walked along Lake Michigan after a symphony performance, David stopped suddenly and took her hands. "Sarah," he said seriously, "I need to tell you something." Her heart skipped with worry. "What is it?" "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "Actually, I think I've already fallen. I know it's only been a month, but I've never felt anything like this before." Sarah felt tears of joy spring to her eyes. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I didn't know love could feel this easy, this right." David kissed her then, soft and sweet under the Chicago stars, and Sarah felt the last pieces of her broken heart heal completely. 6 weeks after their first meeting, Sarah was volunteering at David's free clinic when she saw a familiar small figure in the waiting room. Her heart nearly stopped. Lucy sat quietly in a plastic chair, looking exactly as she had that day in the church, the same worn clothes, the same tangled hair, the same impossibly wise eyes. "Lucy!" Sarah exclaimed, rushing over to the little girl. "What are you doing here? Are you sick? Are you hurt?" Lucy smiled that same serene smile. "I'm fine, Sarah. I just came to see how you're doing." Sarah knelt down to Lucy's eye level, just as she had in the restaurant. "I'm wonderful," she said softly. "You were right about everything. About Michael, about the right man coming, about all of it." "I know," Lucy said simply. "You look happy. Really happy, not just pretend happy." "Lucy, where have you been? I've looked for you everywhere. I wanted to thank you, to help you, to—" Lucy placed her small hand on Sarah's cheek. "You already helped me, sweet Sarah, more than you know." "What do you mean?" "When you chose kindness over pride that day, when you saw me as a person instead of a problem, you changed something. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who saw what you did." Sarah thought back to that day in the church, remembering the hostile faces of the wedding guests, their cruel words about Lucy. "I don't understand." Lucy's eyes twinkled with that familiar mysterious light. "Some of those people at your wedding, they remembered what they saw you do. They started looking at children like me differently. Mrs. Patterson, who sat in the 5th row, she started volunteering at the homeless shelter. Your cousin Amy, she became a foster parent." Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms. "Lucy, who are you?" But the little girl was already standing, preparing to leave. "I'm someone who helps when help is needed," she said enigmatically. "And sometimes, the person who needs the most help is the one who learns to help others. Will I see you again?" Lucy paused at the clinic door and looked back with a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. "Whenever you need to remember that kindness creates miracles, you'll see me." And then, just as she had outside the restaurant, Lucy disappeared into the crowd, leaving Sarah with a profound sense of peace and gratitude. 1 year later, Sarah Chen, she had taken David's name after their small, intimate wedding ceremony, stood in the nursery of their new home, putting the finishing touches on a room that would soon welcome their first foster child, a 7-year-old girl named Maria, who had been living in the system for 3 years. David appeared in the doorway, watching his wife with the same loving expression he had worn every day since they met. "Everything ready?" he asked. "Almost," Sarah replied, smoothing the comforter on the small bed. David, do you think we're doing the right thing? Taking in a child so soon after getting married? David crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind. I think, he said softly, that when love multiplies instead of divides, you're always doing the right thing. Sarah leaned back against her husband's chest, feeling the absolute rightness of their decision. She had left her marketing job 6 months earlier to work for the Department of Children and Family Services, and though the pay was less and the work was harder, she had never been happier or felt more useful. You know, she mused, sometimes I think about that little girl who came to the church that day, Lucy. I wonder where she is, whether she's safe, whether she has enough to eat. What little girl? David asked, sounding confused. Sarah turned in his arms to look at him. Lucy, the homeless girl I told you about? The one who made the promise about bringing me love. David's brow furrowed. Sweetheart, you never told me about any little girl. You said you left the church and went to a restaurant alone to think, and then you met me in the park 2 weeks later. Sarah stared at her husband, her mind reeling. She had vivid memories of telling David all about Lucy, about their meal together, about the little girl's mysterious promises. But looking into David's honest, concerned eyes, she realized that she had never shared that story with anyone. Had it really happened? Or had Lucy been something else entirely? A vision, a dream, an angel sent to guide her at the moment she needed guidance most. As if in answer to her unspoken question, Sarah felt a familiar warmth surround her. The same feeling of pure love and peace she had experienced in Lucy's hug. And in that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that it didn't matter whether Lucy had been real in the conventional sense. What mattered was that a broken woman had learned to open her heart to love, first to a child in need, then to herself, and finally to the man who would cherish her for exactly who she was. What mattered was that acts of kindness rippled outward in ways she might never fully understand, creating miracles both seen and unseen. That evening, as Sarah and David prepared for Maria's arrival the next day, Sarah found herself thinking once more about the day that had changed everything. She remembered standing at the altar in her wedding dress, feeling like her world had ended, never imagining that it was actually beginning. She thought about Michael, who had eventually called to apologize, explaining that he had gotten cold feet and driven to his parents' house in Indianapolis instead of coming to the church. He was engaged now to someone else, a woman who worked at his investment firm and shared his love of golf and expensive restaurants. Sarah felt only gratitude that she had been spared a marriage to someone so fundamentally different from herself. She thought about all the wedding guests who had been so cruel to Lucy, and wondered if Lucy's mysterious claim about some of them changing their hearts was true. She hoped it was. Most of all, she thought about love itself, not the anxious, performing kind of love she had felt with Michael, but the deep, peaceful, joyful love she shared with David, the kind of love that made you want to be your best self while accepting you exactly as you were. As she drifted off to sleep in David's arms, Sarah whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever force had sent Lucy into her life at exactly the right moment. Whether angel or child or something in between, Lucy had delivered on her promise in the most beautiful way imaginable. She had brought Sarah love, not by returning the wrong man, but by opening her heart to receive the right one. And in her dreams that night, Sarah could have sworn she heard the sound of a little girl's laughter, full of joy and the secret knowledge that love always finds a way. In the quiet moments of our deepest pain, when we feel most abandoned and alone, sometimes the universe sends us exactly what we need, not in the form we expect, but in the form we require. And sometimes, the greatest gift we can receive is the opportunity to give to someone else, for in that giving, we discover who we really are and what we're truly capable of becoming. Love lost can become love found. Hearts broken can be made whole. And angels walk among us still, dressed sometimes as the least likely messengers, carrying the most important truths.